Welcome to Sustainable Sewing. I'm Ariana. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to sew a washable, reusable sponge. Before we get started, I would just like to thank the Sharon Public Library's Sewing Threads of Diversity grant for sponsoring this video. Let's get started. You will need 1/4 yard of woven fabric, 1/4 yard of cotton batting, 1/4 yard of net mesh fabric, thread in coordinating colors, fabric scissors, straight pins or fabric clips, a clear beveled ruler, fabric chalk or a water erasable fabric marker, and a sewing machine. Cut 2 pieces of your woven fabric that are 3½ inches by 5½ inch rectangles for the sponge base. To do this, I have my woven fabric folded in half, and I'm using my beveled ruler and my washable fabric marker to draw a 3½ inch by 5½ inch rectangle. You can cut your 3½ inch by 5½ inch rectangle however you feel most comfortable. You can also create a 3½ inch by 5½ inch paper pattern, lay that on top of the fabric, pin it down, and cut it out. Now I'm going to add pins inside the rectangle to ensure that the 2 layers of fabric don't move when I go to cut. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut out my rectangle. Next, cut 2 pieces of 3½ inch by 5½ inch rectangles in your net mesh fabric for the scrubby part of the sponge. As usual, you can do this in whichever way feels most comfortable for you. For cutting the net mesh, what I'm doing is I'm using my ruler and I'm using my mat and I'm counting the measurements on the mat and then clipping them so I know where the 3½ inch by 5½ inch mark is. Then I'm cutting out the rectangles. Lastly, cut 3 to 4 pieces of your cotton batting at 3½ inches by 5½ inches to create rectangles that will be used for the inside of the sponge. I'm going to use 4 layers of cotton batting. So what I'm doing is I have my cotton batting folded in half, and I'm using my washable fabric marker and my beveled ruler to mark the 3½ inches by 5½ inches on the cotton batting. I'm doing that twice, and then I'm cutting out 2 layers of double cotton batting. As always, I'm pinning the 2 layers of fabric together so that they do not shift when I go to cut. Place 1 piece of woven fabric with the right side up. The side of the fabric that you want to see is the right side. And then place 2 pieces of net mesh fabric on top of that piece. Now place the second piece of woven fabric with the right side down on top of the mesh layers. And lastly, place the 3 to 4 pieces of cotton batting on the very top. Now I'm going to flip this all over so that when I create a mark, I'm going to be doing so on my cotton fabric. It will be easier to do so. So once I flip this all over, making sure that the layers are still in the same order, I'm going to put pins or clips along the sides. Mark a 2-inch opening on one side of the sponge in chalk or a washable fabric marker. This mark will be the opening that you use to turn the sponge right side out after sewing. Sew the layers together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the edges, starting from the opening mark and finishing the stitch at the other opening mark. Don't forget to backstitch when you start and finish your seam. Remove the pins as you go or when you're finished sewing. Now trim all 4 corners to lessen the bulk. Be careful when you cut. You don't want to cut through any of your seams, but cut as close as you can without cutting through the seams. Turn the sponge right side out so that the right side of the woven fabric is on one side of the sponge and the double layers of mesh fabric is on the other side. Now fold the opening raw edges inside the sponge and pin the opening closed. Top stitch around the entire sponge carefully about 3/8 of an inch from the edge. At this point, you can choose to add a second top stitch about 1/4 inch away from the first one if you would like. I'm going to do that. This concludes our lesson on how to sew a washable, reusable sponge. Thank you so much for sewing with me today, and I can't wait to see you next time.